Opitz is a native of Massachusetts. He received his college degree in political science with a minor in economics. He has a theological degree and was ordained as a congregational minister. He taught at Curry College in Boston and Harrisburg Academy. He is the author of The Powers That Be, the co-author of The Kingdom Without God, the author of Religion and Capitalism, Allies Not Enemies, which was a conservative book club selection in 1970. He joined the fee staff in 1955. He's a founder and coordinator for The Remnant, which is an organization of clergymen who are libertarian, conservative in outlook. And the title of his talk is Two Concepts of Equality.
Thank you, Bumper, for that very fine introduction. I wrote it. I have an announcement to make. We have called off the nature walk today. And for the sports-minded, there will be aerobic Patrizi in the lounge this afternoon. I'm pleased that there are two other New Englanders here. I'm not sure, I met one of them, John Groom, and Stan Rubenstein. Where's Stan?
He's not here yet.
Not here yet. From my hometown.
He's waiting for the question session.
Good. Well, this is a little different format than usual. Usually, each of us has an hour and a half, 90 minutes. Hour for the lecture, 30 minutes for discussion. But we'll get to that. New Englanders are almost born economists, John. I was brought up, and you may have been too, with the slogan or the advice, use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. So Yankees are penny pinchers, and there are a number of jokes about the penny pinching proclivities of Yankees. My favorite has to do with an action taken by the Board of Selectmen of Barnstable County, which is Cape Cod, the arm of Massachusetts. About 100 years ago, the local jail in Barnstable was getting to be awfully shabby, and the people of Barnstable and the county didn't like the looks of their jail. So they put the pressure on the selectmen, and the selectmen passed a 4-point resolution. Point 1, the county needs a new jail. Point 2, to save the costs of material, the jail will be built, the new jail built from the timber and bricks obtained by tearing down the old jail. To save the costs of labor, the work will be performed by the prisoners. Point 4, the prisoners will live in the old jail till the new jail is completed. Well, that is not just a joke. That is our situation within any society where we happen to be. We cannot extract ourselves from out of our society to operate on it from some external vantage point. And finally, a touch of class, a little bit of poetry, which I got from the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago. If no one listens to your pitch, perhaps you need a semantic switch. Folks will come from near and far if it's called a seminar. One of the big words in modern political discourse of the past several centuries is voiced in the slogans of two quite different revolutions which occurred the latter part of the 18th century. Our own was liberty, equality, and property. The French was liberty, equality, fraternity. Heard a story that Talleyrand got so fed up with all this chatter about fraternity that he said, if I had a brother, I'd call him cousin. And there's, I think, maybe some valid reason to justify the reaction of Talleyrand, because the demand for unlimited brotherliness puts our emotional nature under a strain. Our capacity for affection is limited. We can be friends with a few people, acquaintances with others, but for the most part, the millions around the globe are unknown to us. Brotherliness or fraternity or love translates, when the numbers grow beyond a certain point, into justice. We want justice for everybody, where we can love and be fond of or be friends with our family, our circle of friends, and a larger circle of acquaintances. Talleyrand may have heard the story about the French revolutionary who would go around with a pistol and point the pistol at someone's head and say, "Be my brother or I'll kill you." Well, we like a happy medium in cases of that sort. The French epigrammist La Bruyere, writing in the 17th century, made an important point. He said, "Some ask why mankind in general do not compose one nation and are not contented to speak one language, to live under the same laws and agree among themselves to have the same customs and the same worship. Whilst I, seeing how contrary are their minds, their tastes, and their sentiments, wonder to see even 7 or 8 persons living within the same walls, under the same roof, making up a single family." And we have lots of enlightened intellectuals today who keep their personal lives tied together with constant psychiatry and go through a succession of wives, can't keep their family together, who have no doubt that if they were put in charge, they could coordinate the whole world. Well, so much for the word fraternity, which is not in our political discourse. But the idea of equality occupies a very prominent spot in our own political, philosophical past. Our declaration reads, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." I admire Thomas Jefferson, the major architect of the Declaration, and the people he had on his committee. I think they used the English language rather well, and they chose their words carefully. They didn't say, "It is obvious." They said, "We hold." We, the heirs of a 2,000, 3,000-year-old tradition dating back to the ancient world, we, products of this culture, hold these truths to be self-evident. They didn't say that all men are equal. They didn't say all men are becoming equal, or that all men ought to be equal. They didn't say they were born equal, but that they are created equal. Now, my guess is, I can't read Jefferson's mind, that he had in his thinking the idea that the created part of a man or a woman is his mind or his psyche or his soul. Now, you boil down our carcass, and it comes down to the elements commonly found in the Earth's crust. But there is something else, said Jefferson and the others, something that sets man apart from nature, from the rest of creation, his mental and spiritual faculties. Jefferson's motto was, "The God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time." And it's an article of faith in the religious tradition of Christendom. Christendom, the culture compounded of elements derived from ancient Hebrews, from the Greeks and the Romans, that man is a created being. To say that man is a created being means simply that he is a work of divine art and not a chance end product of the interaction of chemical and physical forces. John Locke told us that man is God's property because he made us. Man can acquire property if he manufactures something out of that which is not property, but God made us, and along the lines that the product belongs to the producer, said John Locke, we are his property. Which means that the soul of each person is precious in God's sight and equal in God's sight, from which you derive the conclusion that whatever the person's outward circumstances may be, his equality before the throne of God means that equal justice before the law in our mundane affairs is implicit in that premise. That is, one law for all men and women alike, because we are all one in our essential humanness. However, we are different and varied in every other way. Now, equal justice before the law is the same thing as political liberty from a different perspective. It's also justice, a regime under which no man and no order of men, no aristocracy, is given a political license to use other people as their tools. When you have a framework in society of liberty, equality, and justice, these are Adam Smith's words too, this framework virtually mandates a market economy or capitalism. If there is a society with no politically granted privileges, then the economic order has to be capitalistic or free market. Political equality is the system of liberty. Listen to Jefferson setting forth its major features in his first inaugural. Equal and exact justice to all men of whatever state or persuasion, religious or political. Peace, commerce, honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. That phrase often attributed to Washington is Jefferson's, no entangling alliances. Freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of the person under the protection of the habeas corpus, and so on and so on. Well, this idea of political equality or equal justice before the law is a new idea. Read the great original treatise on political theory, Aristotle's Politics. In the first chapter, there is a discussion of slavery, arguing on behalf of slavery, winding up with Aristotle saying, "It is clear, then, that some men are by nature free and others slaves, and that for these latter, slavery is both expedient and right." And then someone in the circle to whom he was talking said, "But Aristotle, that slave over there was a scion of the royal house in the tribe we conquered. He can't be of inferior blood." And Aristotle coughs up his sleeve. And there was Plato, Aristotle's teacher, who would like to see society constructed something like a pyramid. A few men at the top wielding unlimited power, and the men on each level below being bossed by those above them. On the bottom are the slaves who outnumber all the rest in democratic Athenian society. Now, Plato knows, as we all would know, that those in the lower ranks will not be contented with their lot unless we can con them into believing that they belong there. So he proposes to condition them with what he calls a noble lie, or elsewhere he calls it an opportune falsehood. While all of you in the city are brothers, we will say in our tale, these are Plato's words, while all of you in the city are brothers, we will say in our tale, yet God, in fashioning those of you who are fitted to hold rule, mingled gold in their moment of conception, but in the helpers, silver, and iron and brass in the farmers and other craftsmen. Well, you know darn well that people who concoct theories of this sort never discover iron and brass in their own makeup. It's always gold. And then there's a contemporary example, Hinduism, a structured caste society. We are born into a given caste, and that's where we will stay. There is no ladder leading up from one caste to the next one. We are where we are because of what we were in a previous incarnation. We are working out the penance for the evils we did in a previous incarnation. If we are a Shudra or if we're a Brahmin, then we did awfully well last time around, and we're being rewarded now for earlier virtues. A fellow named S. Radhakrishnan, a great Hindu scholar and statesman of the preceding generation, gave a series of lectures at Manchester College in Oxford, published as The Hindu View of Life. And Radhakrishnan justifies society with a metaphor. Radhakrishnan likens society to a lamp and says, when the wick is aglow at the tip, the whole lamp is said to be burning. So it does seem he's saying that a few well-lit Brahmins justify all the misery in the ranks below. These three illustrations point to the conclusion that the decisions we make in political philosophy depend upon our convictions in the realm of metaphysics or ontology, or you might say our theology. That is our Weltanschauung. Our Weltanschauung meaning worldview, the German word for a worldview. Your notion as to what the totality is like is your Weltanschauung or worldview, or your theology, or your metaphysics, or whatever. Well, we make different assumptions in political philosophizing than did the ancient Greeks or than do the modern Hindus, because we have a different metaphysics or a different theology. The religious values undergirding our culture derive mainly from the Bible, which our forebears of 2 centuries ago regarded as a textbook in liberty. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, they quoted, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Now we take personal liberty for granted, whereas Plato took slavery for granted, because we have had a couple of thousand years of exposure to the idea of the worth, the importance, the dignity, the sacredness of the individual psyche or soul. Now it takes a long time for a big idea to seep into the thinking, the habits, the customs, and finally the laws of a culture. It took about 18th century before a fellow named Smith came along and drew out the implications for social or economic or political organization of the conviction that man is a freely choosing creature. And of course I'm using the term man in the old generic sense, including male and female. Smith, as I intimated, referred to his system as the liberal plan of liberty, equality, and justice. 3 words which point in the same direction to a certain kind of a society distinguishable from preceding societies, in Smith's case, the aristocratic order of England, in other cases, to a variety of forms which the systems of privilege take. England's aristocratic order did not arise by accident. It emerged in the aftermath of a conquest. You all know the story. William of Normandy had a certain claim to the throne occupied by Harold. Harold didn't see it build way, so William has got a few of his noble friends to accompany him across the Channel. They met Harold and his men on an October day in 1066, and they beat them. They fought about 30 more battles, and then William and his noble friends had the whole landmass of England under their thumb. So what should William then do to reward his friends? He decided to divide up England. He allowed the church to keep, I'm quoting Arthur Bryant here, the church was allowed to keep about 25% of the territory. William took a fifth for himself, which is 45%, which left 55% to be divvied up among 170 noble Norman followers of William. 10 of these got half of that, or 27.5%. 160 got the rest. So now,
What year, sir?
1066. So now the Normans were England's landlords, and they were also rulers. Feudal rulership is based upon large-scale land ownership. It means the same thing to say the Normans owned England as to say the Normans ruled England. And because the Normans did not work, really, they fought, lounged, they ate, and so on, because they did not work, nevertheless lived, as they thought, rather well. We would think uncomfortably in dirty, drafty conditions and so on, but compared to the Anglo-Saxon peasant hut, the Norman, in his manner, lived rather well without working for it. Now, is this the result of a miracle? No, because the ownership or rulership of England enabled the Normans, using feudal privileges, to extract certain money and property from the peasants who worked. It didn't take some smart Anglo-Saxon more than a couple of generations to figure out that the reason why I am so poor is because that Norman up on the hill in the manor is so rich. His richness is a function of my poverty. In the course of his getting rich, he impoverishes me, which is the way it is in every system of privilege, aristocratic or whatever. 1984, the welfare state, take your choice. Now, when our forebears accepted the propositions of the Declaration that all men are created equal, they, of course, threw down a challenge to the idea of a privileged arrangement of society which would enable some people possessing power to obtain economic advantage by the way they use the power. They believed that the law should keep the peace, as peacekeeping is spelled out in the old-fashioned Whig, classical liberal tradition, which would preserve a free field and no favor. Free field and no favor, the original meaning of laissez-faire. I think the term laissez-faire bears some relation to laissez-aller, which, if you have read Ivanhoe or The Once and Future King or a few other things, you know that laissez-aller was the term used by the judge or referee or the umpire whenever a couple of mail-clad knights on horseback with lances tilted got ready to ride at each other. The referee yelled out, laissez-aller, and this meant, you boys know the rules, fight fair within the rules, may the best man win, and so on. Government, under laissez-faire, does not intervene positively to manage or regulate the affairs of men. It merely acts or reacts to redress injury, as injury is spelled out in the laws. This is the system of liberty championed by libertarians and conservatives at the present time. Most of you have heard the name of a celebrated English Fabian socialist, R.H. Tawney. Tawney wrote a book in 1932 called simply Equality, arguing in effect that no one should own two cars or two suits so long as there was one person without a car or without a suit. But Tawney did acknowledge the importance of the concept of equality, which I have been stressing, the older concept of equality that appealed to Adam Smith and the Whigs and became classical liberalism. He said, slavery and serfdom had survived the exhortations of the Christian church, the reforms of enlightened despots, and the protests of humanitarian philosophers from Seneca to Voltaire. But before the new spirit and the practical urgencies of which it was the expression, slavery and serfdom disappeared, except from dark backwaters, in 3 generations. This new principle of equality turned the peasant from a beast of burden into a human being. It determined that when science should be invoked to increase the output of the soil, its cultivator, and not some absentee landlord, should reap the fruits. The principle which released him he described as equality. Equality, the destruction of privilege. End of the quotation. Tawney then quickly turns his back on this idea of equality and goes on to the idea of economic leveling. All of these good things were the result of an effort a couple of centuries ago, and in a generation or two beyond that, to put this idea of equality and liberty, equal rights before the law, into practice. But of course, when men are free politically, there will continue to be economic inequalities. There will continue to be rich and poor, as there have been rich and poor under any kind of conditions ever since, well, history began. But there's now this difference. Now, under the system of liberty or equality before the law, that is the free economy, the wealthy will be chosen by the daily balloting of their peers in the marketplace, by the way people spend their money. And in a system of liberty, the wealthy won't necessarily be the powerful, nor will the poor necessarily be the weak. Variation. Variation is a fact of life. Individuals differ one from the other. Some are tall and some are short. Some are fat and some are skinny. Some are bright and some are not so bright. Some are gifted along musical lines. Others are talented mathematicians. And there are some people with a knack for making money. Under whatever conditions they find themselves, they'll make a buck. A man to whom I owe a lot, a great naturalist who was a neighbor of mine just after World War II, a man named Henry Beston, used to say that if you put a dollar bill on a table and you seat a dozen people around that dining room table and sit back, that dollar bill will begin to move. It'll move toward one of those persons. Well, there's something like that that does operate. It operates even in communist nations.
Which table was that exactly?
Roulette table. I think, Ivan, that you might attest to this, that things happen as were described by Milovan Gilis in the book The New Class. In a communist nation, based upon the idea in part of economic leveling, a new class emerges. And this new class has special privileges and advantages denied to the rest of the people in this society. They occupy mansions, they don't own them, they occupy them, the mansion is not theirs, it's the state's. They have a lot of servants, but they aren't their servants, they belong to the state, they're supplied to this person. They have a long black car driven by a liveried chauffeur. It is not their car, not their chauffeur, but they have the advantages of using them. Now, under the system of liberty, in contrast to all these systems of privilege, only one system of liberty, where the political structure, the law, does not regulate, direct, to control people, but only acts if someone is injured. One system of liberty called Whiggism, classical liberalism, similar to present-day conservatism and libertarianism. But there are many systems of privilege, and communism turns out to be one more system of privilege, as has the welfare state in our own country. Now, the free market, as you all are aware, the free market, which is the buying habits of our neighbors, will reward some people more handsomely than it will reward other people. Some people make a lot of money. People like teachers and preachers don't make very much money. But under the system of liberty, there is no underclass who fear a knock on the door at 5 o'clock in the morning. They can go about their daily round of activities without getting anyone's permission. They're free, and that partly compensates for the fact that a poor teacher doesn't have a lot of worldly wealth. So differentials in wealth characterize every conceivable kind of society. This is a fact of life. This is the way things are. Now, this variation in human beings is not within our power to alter. And if we understood the situation, we would not wish to alter it. The proposition, which is an alternative to political equality, is economic equality, which is not even a coherent, thinkable proposition. We can will political liberty, and our forebears in the classical liberal tradition did will equality before the law, with the happy results we have noted, the abolition of slavery and serfdom eventually. Under conditions of political equality, a man's income depends upon his success at pleasing consumers. And as we all know, Ralph Nader reminds us of it, consumers are ignorant, indifferent, neurotic. They're awful people because they're people just like us. We're the consumers he's talking about. At this game of pleasing consumers, some people are better than other people. Variation would lead us to expect this. A certain entertainer, I read in one of these movie columns, made $8 million last year by howling and gyrating in public places. I am positive that no viola player made anywhere near that amount of money. No French horn player has made that much, I know. Now, this fellow, James Brown, didn't get any of my money, and I have an inclination, if I had a lot of money, to have him permanently tranquilized, except for the fact that I believe in personal liberty. And then, on a somewhat higher level than these musicians, there are manufacturers, say, who are gifted with the capacity to make an educated guess as to where the hemline, for example, will be next season, and in virtue of this talent they possess, they make a bundle of money by engaging successfully in economic competition. Two schools of thought at the present time. The present-day liberals and socialists and communists, people of that persuasion, posit the idea that on this planet there is natural abundance. There is potential prosperity for all if only the enemy would stop getting in our way. It's some enemy that prevents this natural abundance from giving prosperity to all. Whereas our position, the position of most Manchester or Austrian school economists, the position of libertarians and conservatives is, on this planet, things are scarce. Over the door of the economics laboratory, there'd be these words, things are scarce. Human labor is in short supply. Everything we want and have to pay for is in short supply, otherwise we wouldn't have to pay for it. Things are in short supply. Because things are in short supply, poverty is the natural state of mankind, not prosperity. The liberals are trying to say, how come we have this poverty? Or as we're trying to say, under what conditions did prosperity emerge? How can we retain the prosperity which is so scarce on this planet? Looking for an answer, we have to go back to the kind of social arrangements made in given societies. If the natural condition of mankind is poverty, it's the result of the oscillation between, to use present-day exemplars of the different types of the different sides of the spectrum, societies oscillate between the mindless, anarchic chaos of Lebanon, or Bedford-Stuyvesant, or Harlem, or Central Park, and the equally mindless, stupid fanaticism of places like Iran. How seldom do we get in history a society where people can walk safely out of doors and enjoy the freedom to generate the prosperity which every person is capable of. In any event, the big issue today still is, after we've worked at this ever since the New Deal, is poverty. And God knows there's a lot of it. You walk around the streets of New York, if you took a train from Grand Central, you came through some disastrous condition, which need not be, should not be. But we have worked in the wrong way to alleviate poverty ever since Mr. Roosevelt took office, and long before that, and Republicans. Now, indigence or poverty, I suppose, can be measured in a variety of ways. We can measure poverty by what it does to the human spirit, for example. However, at the ground level, a person who is poor has a suit several years old, which he at the time bought from the Salvation Army. He lives on macaroni and cheese. His room is a sparse thing with a grass rug on the floor and a steel cot that he sleeps in. That is indigence. It's measured by a lack of material things. If you were to move our man from indigence toward prosperity, you would get him a new suit, a couple of pairs of slacks and a sport jacket, nice top coat. You would give him more and better food. You would improve his habitat by getting him an apartment, eventually a house, and a cabin on the lake, and so on. Point to note is that people move out of indigence or poverty in the direction of prosperity only as they command more of the things that are produced by human labor, grown, manufactured, transported, or otherwise produced. In short, poverty is to be overcome by productivity, and in no other way, by goods that are not now in existence, that come into existence only as human ingenuity and effort is applied using tools to raw materials. It would seem, therefore, that anyone seriously concerned with the alleviation of poverty should be equally intensely concerned with the enhancement of productivity. But try to find in this great land of ours anybody deeply concerned with increasing the effectiveness of production. There are some able production men in industry, but as we know, many established businesses have learned to live comfortably with restrictive legislation, government contracts, the foreign aid program, our various international commitments, and so on. The competitive instinct burns low, and the entrepreneur, willing to submit his offering of goods and services to the harsh conditions of the market, is a rare bird. And then there are the farmers. Agricultural production has leaped upward in recent years, but no thanks to the owners of gigantic farms who accept government money for keeping their land and machinery out of production. Monopoly union leaders talk about the benefits they have gained for their workers, but I've never heard one talk about increasing productivity. And of course, politicians are not interested in increased industrial or agricultural productivity. As a matter of fact, it might be said that the national government is continually, by its unwise interventions, manufacturing poverty at a greater rate than the free enterprise section can overcome the poverty so stupidly created. Thank you. A great increase of goods and services made possible by increased productivity, which is within our capacity, is the only way to deal with the condition of poverty. But the clamor is for redistribution, for political intervention which exact tribute from the haves and seek to bestow largesse on the have-nots. I'm arguing for a political structure whose primary task is to defend the life, liberty, and property of all persons alike. That is a social condition which mandates the market economy, because no one has an artificially, politically created advantage over anybody else. Now, the market is not a magic instrumentality which comes up with a right answer to all sorts of questions. I hear some of my friends talk, and they talk as if the market were some entity hovering over society, as Uncle Sam is said to hover over the White House. No such thing. The market is sort of a popularity contest. The market tells us what is popular, not necessarily what is a worthwhile product. The market tells us what people want, what they like, what they'll buy. It's an index of their preferences. The market provides a very valuable piece of information, but it is far from the whole story. For example, it's an important function of the market to provide an entrepreneur with some clue as to what people will be buying next season. But a similar fingering of the popular pulse is an abomination in the intellectual or moral realm, unless one is a liberal intellectual. I have in mind the tendency of the current crop of liberal opinion molders who think they're opinion molders, their tendency to ask, what is going to be the fashion in ideas next season so they can hop on the bandwagon? One of my former professors, lately retired from Union Theological Seminary, was, when I had him, a strong proponent of getting other Americans into World War II. And in latter years, he'd been a co-chairman of SANE. This man has a good market in the intellectual realm, but despises the market where it functions well in the economic realm. The market is the only device available to mankind for serving our creaturely needs efficiently and non-wastefully, but the market is no gauge of the truth or the falsity of an idea. If it were, how come the books of Galbraith and Samuelson far outsell the books of Hayek and Mises? In my view, Hayek and Mises, as economists, political philosophers, as thinkers, are about 1,000,000 light years ahead of Galbraith and Samuelson. Nevertheless, Galbraith and Samuelson had made themselves millions by their books, and Hayek and Mises struggled along. Likewise, in aesthetic questions, an entertainer's popularity is no true gauge of his musicianship. A best-selling novel may fall far short of the category of literature. In short, the market is simply a mirror of popular tastes and prejudices. It's a reflex of our ignorance, of our poor taste, of our low ethics, and so on. However, if we don't like what the mirror reveals, it won't do any good simply to throw rocks at the mirror. Well, as I say, there is a good deal more to life than merely pleasing consumers, but if the integrity of the market is not respected, if consumer choice is impaired by some people with power, then some people are given a license to foist their values upon others, and the kind of poison which infects economic relationships, if there is political intervention into the marketplace, will gradually infect other areas, more important areas as well. We do throw rocks at the mirror whenever we undertake programs of economic leveling aimed at economic equality. The government promises to aid the poor by redistributing the wealth, the already existing stock of wealth. But this, of course, is a power play. Before it can be accomplished, a few people wielding power must have the masses of people at their disposal. And in any power play, it has to be the poor, who are by definition the weak, who get hurt first and most. That is, economic inequalities cannot be overcome by political redistribution without increasing political inequalities. Some people have more power, citizens have less power. Political contests become more intense because enormous amounts of wealth are at stake. And then it dawns upon those who wield power, well, gee, it felt pretty good for a little while to take from those filthy rich and give it to the deserving poor, But these poor aren't so deserving. They aren't as charming as the people of the jet set. Why are we giving them money? So Robin Hood, first of all, possibly, taking from the rich to give to the poor, winds up by taking from the rich to bestow it upon Robin Hood and his friends. Those of you who are fans of Lewis Carroll might remember his poem, a poem in 8 fits, he called it, entitled The Hunting of the Snark. The snark was a mythical beast, like your abominable snowman up near Spokane. And in the poem, there were hunters pursuing this strange mythical beast. And every time they thought to close in on their quarry, the snark turned out to be a boudreaux, something quite different. And every time human beings have sought to concentrate power in a central government to carry out their program, the power they have concentrated gets out of hand. The classic example, of course, is the French Revolution, which turned on those who set it up and devoured its children. To embark upon a program of economic leveling is like trying to repeal the law of gravity. It'll never work. And the effort we expend in trying to make it work will exhaust us to the point where we will not accomplish the worthwhile goals which might be otherwise within our grasp. Well, there is not much time for questions, about 10 minutes if I read the program correctly. 9:45, 10:45. Yes, John?
When you say that the market doesn't measure the truth or falsity of an idea, are you saying in the short run or in the long run, or what? Because it seems like the market in the longer run, like our money system, the fraudulent bankers, when we did private money was allowed.
But we have to learn and whatever truth does turn up has to be learned and relearned again and again. There's still the same fallacies to be demolished. So in the short run, certainly. In the long run, people learn from experience that certain things don't work. So they try something else, but then the same old tendencies seem to set in.
Okay, but then when you say that the poor in any power play get hurt, are you talking about power plays, economic power plays made by individuals, or are you talking about government?
No, I'm talking about as a result of government interventions. When this was a longer talk, I talked about the categories of people who have a stake in big interventionist government. One category would be the social workers. I have a quotation by Thomas Sowell, who many of you know, black economist. For some reason, I suppose because he was black, he got a piece into the New York Times magazine several years ago, talking about this matter of how do we help the poor? Well, there are hundreds of thousands or millions of bureaucrats engaged in helping the poor, but Thomas Sowell concludes by saying, to be blunt, the poor are a gold mine. By the time the poor are studied, advised, experimented with, and administered, the poor have helped many a middle-class liberal to achieve affluence with government money. The total amount of money the government spends on its, he put quotation marks, on its anti-poverty efforts is 3 times what would be required to lift every woman, man, and child in America above the poverty line simply by sending money to the poor. So when it's a case of an interventionist government trying to overcome poverty, the poor become a rationale, a continuing, you've got to have the poor, otherwise the welfare state wouldn't have a plausible case for being. But the poor are not helped by the welfare state. The poor are helped by people who say, get off their backs. I came across a quotation, which I've also used in this piece, made on the scaffold in England in 1685 by a Richard Rumbold, also used by Thomas Jefferson in a letter. Richard Rumbold said, I never could believe that Providence had sent a few into the world ready booted and spurred to ride, and sent millions ready saddled and bridled to be ridden. So, again, you can quote Tolstoy. The first thing to do for the poor is get off their backs, and that's what the Whigs tried to do. The Whig breakthrough. Adam Smith was a Whig, Jefferson a Whig, Madison and so on. The Whig breakthrough was not on behalf of the rich. Obviously not. Under any system, some people do well, and the people who are doing well don't want to change the ballgame. They want the same old rule to obtain. It was a breakthrough in favor of those who hadn't done too well, economically or otherwise, and they began to do very well, and then the same old fallacies set in again. Yes?
What was that reference by, say it Sennholz? By Mr. Sennholz?
I'll give you a copy of it. It's the New York Times, the magazine, 8876. Uh-huh.
It seems to me that the innovation of government and markets for the objective, politically and economically, the objective of helping the poor, not only doesn't help the poor, but it increases the size of the poor because of the people that it victimizes today a tiny paycheck.
Mm-hmm.
The person who works all day long at a job, is productive within his capacity, then gets taxed at ever-increasing levels. So ultimately, his children don't get an education. Ultimately, he joins the ranks of poor.
Mm-hmm.
Then they also redefine the poor on a periodic basis, so the poor continue to stay with us because of government definition of who's poor.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, you're poor in Washington, D.C. if you have a $21,000 a year income.
Yes.
And you're, in a lot of places, people would be delighted to be poor at that level.
Well, they talk as if the poor were a separate caste with a red mark in their foreheads to distinguish them from us ordinary folk. Not so. Most of our ancestors were poor. We were poor during the 1930s Depression. I guess 30 years ago I didn't have as much as I have now, and the rest of you likewise. So there's been economic progress despite the efforts of the bureaucrats to stifle it. We'd be a lot better off, and in a market economy, the wealth would be shared broadly. Most every society, if you were to draw a graph of its wealth distribution, would be something like, up here there'd be the Maharaja or the ruler with a lot of palaces and so on, and down here the vast bulk of people. Down here is starvation. But our society still typically has a few people up at the top who are pretty well-to-do, has some grades down here, and a few people down below who are very badly off. Some of these down here are prevented by laws from getting onto the first rung of the ladder. If you were, for example, you were a plumber, and in this county, I think you'd face what they call grandfather laws. Anybody can join the plumbers union and practice plumbing in Westchester County if your grandfather was a plumber or something of the sort. So not everybody can get in. So there are monopolies of a variety of kinds, many imposed by unions. I don't have the figures here at the moment, but the craft unions, where the money is to be made, are largely barred. I should say, blacks are largely barred from the craft unions, whose leaders are sheet metal workers, plumbers, electricians, in the New York area at least. So that if you have government interventions egged on by people with positions of advantage to get their people in government to pass certain laws, then you keep people in their low estate, keep them poor generation after generation. Yes, sir?
Sir, we have always had, though, the monopoly of the crafts and the guilds, etc.
True.
Certainly since medieval times. I don't know too much about ancient times. I'm sure they had the same thing.
Yeah.
I'm sure they had the same thing. Why are there certain breakthroughs? And why do you think, now you're the third of our three lectures that we've had so far, why do you think there was a breakthrough nonetheless, so that we did have and have experienced some, say, some of the benefits of capital?
Well, before this breakthrough 2 centuries ago, a friend of mine, Pierre Goodrich, the late Pierre Goodrich, coined a phrase I like. all of these people was a fair advantage over their fellows.
Like Tim O'Neill.
Yeah. I could argue, I believe, and I will later on this week, that the individual's desire to be free to pursue his personal goals is a biological urge. The breakthrough 2 centuries ago was the idea of equal freedom. It takes a while for that to sink in. Here's, for example, a fellow steps out of the pages of Homer, out of the heroic age. He's a tough warrior, has a broadsword at his side. He wants something that somebody else has, and the somebody else is an ignorant, weak barbarian. You tell this heroic warrior, now what you should do is respect the rights of this ignorant, stupid barbarian and bargain with him. He says, me bargaining with that guy? No. It takes a long time for the idea that equal freedom is mandated because we are all creatures of God and alike have some purpose in God's indiscernible plans. So the step from the drive for freedom to the idea of equal freedom is from a biological urge to a religious mandate. It's a mandate you don't find, of course, in lots of religions. You find it in the biblical religion. That is in Old and New Testaments, and in the kinds of mores that developed out of those foundations, which are Hebraic, Greek, and Roman, to form the culture of Christendom. But it takes a long time for people to catch on. Some people caught on, but not enough people caught on to make it effective socially. John?
You mentioned Thomas Sowell.
Yeah.
And also Reverend Williams mentioned the perfect versus the imperfect view of man. Sowell kind of reduces that down to almost everything. If you know whether somebody thinks it's the perfect view of man or the imperfect view of man, you can almost know what he's going to think all the way down the line from
Yeah.
how he's going to vote to what his views are on just about any issue. Do you see it simplifying that much, or we can talk about any of that later on?
The term perfect, as used in the New Testament, where
Perfectibility of man versus the
be ye therefore perfect, the word perfect has a meaning of fulfilling whatever potentialities there are in you. In that sense, I believe in it. That is, in becoming all that you are capable of becoming. But when it comes to the perfectibility of man in a society made perfect, providing all people with the fulfillment of their potentiality, this is a very dangerous, a very bad, and a pretty stupid idea. We are imperfect in knowledge, imperfect in action, which does not mean that the human life is not worth living. I would say that if we have this notion of the perfectibility of man, John may have mentioned a book by, I think, an Australian philosopher, I forget his name at the moment, called The Perfectibility of Man, describing the philosophies of the past couple of centuries, launched by the French philosophes. The French philosophes discovered that mankind has now come of age, and mankind can now take charge of its own affairs, which, if you translate that from the French, means we who have discovered this are going to take charge of your affairs. The American Revolution was quite different from the French in that, I'll be talking about this later on in the week, but it's apparently a difficult idea to get across. Thoreau was quoted as saying that government governs best which governs not at all. Now, the old idea of government was that it governed in the sense of regulating, controlling. The Whig idea said, no, that's passe. We don't want that. We want government reduced to the jibe was, we want a night watchman state. The night watchman doesn't do anything in the factory during the course of the night. He simply guards it. In case somebody breaks in, he takes action. But he's not going to tell people how to run the factory. We want a political order which Knox distinguished from the state. Government is one thing. Government is what the Whigs had in mind, a breakthrough in government, a government that does not govern. It's the idea of Bastiat's the law. The law protects life, liberty, and property, but the law perverted takes property from some and gives it to others. Yes, sir.
Everyone I hear talk they complain about the government redounds to being bad, reflecting other sources of bad in society. If you interfere in the economy, if government interferes in the economy, it has other bad reflections.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone says that freedom, the greater freedom for man, the better it is.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we still cling to the belief in government. I mean, there's something inherent in us that we say, but we have to have something out there to govern us. And I'm wondering if is that just do you think it's just an appendage, we've had it in the past and we can't imagine living without it, when we all believe that it does nothing but bad. We all think it'd be great as just a night watchman, but we can't keep it a night watchman.
Albert J. Nock, in a book called Our Enemy the State, which I will try to sell you copies of later on, besides it's a free copy of his essay, Isaiah's Job, said, the state is government perverted. So we want the government, we don't want its perversion. Bastiat said we want the law, that is, some agency to protect life, liberty, and property, but not the law perverted. Now, something like 1 million people have read the foundation version of Bastiat's The Law. I have yet to meet anyone, including the translator, who has a lively sense of the importance of the distinction that Bastiat makes between the law and the law perverted. No point in waiting until Friday for this. I've got a talk on Friday where I'll be dealing with this case that some of our friends who call themselves anarcho-capitalists make. Why not abolish the whole thing? Which is like saying some people make themselves ill by eating too much of the wrong kinds of food, and the only cure is to abolish food altogether. Or we say, some people don't like the decision made by this umpire. Let's let each team have its own umpire or corps of umpires and settle the matter, whether the guy was out at first or safe at first, by having the umpires battle it out or whatever. So there has to be some set of rules before you can have a society that's viable at all. You couldn't have a society if everybody robbed, everybody assaulted, everybody murdered when given the opportunity. You have to have a certain set of rules, otherwise you couldn't have a society. Next question is, if everybody is to be given his own interpretation of the rules, that's the same thing as no rules at all. So you have to have a set of rules which hopefully people will be wise enough to figure out, and secondly, someone doing the fairly simple job of interpreting and enforcing these rules. Procedure, the law, of which we've had several thousand years of experience. So we have a tremendous body of legal decisions and precedents which give us a little clue as to how we should operate today. Isn't that right, Bumper? You're a lawyer. I've talked overtime, Bumper, because no one would let me out of here. So we.
Well, it's no longer overtime because in response to consumer demand, I have revised the schedule so you have till 11.
You can see how sensitive we are here to what we're talking about, namely consumer demand. Mr. Huddleston.
It seems that Reverend Ike's philosophy, as we discussed, poor people and the burdens of being poor. Reverend Ike, although has a fairly simplistic philosophy, it seems to be efficient but difficult to reach. The best thing you can do for poor people is not be one up.
Mm-hmm. Reb Ike, in case you don't know, was a black preacher in New York. I haven't heard him lately, but he used to be on television, and maybe he still is. Whatever his scheme amounts to in general, it has worked for him. He's made a lot of money himself. My dentist's son went to a party for one of Ike's sons. They both are students, or were students, at the Hackney School, a private school up here. And Dr. Miller went over to pick up his son when the party was over. And he said, there was this tremendous mansion. Butler opened the front door. There was a long hallway hung with tapestries. So Rev Ike is doing a great job. And he has his sights set on the ultimate goal, relieve the ranks of the poor by one by making yourself not poor. And you do this, as we'll be talking this week, you do this by don't standing in the way of anyone who wants to improve his material well-being or whatever else he wants to do. There's no more reason, it seems to me, no more reason for regulating a businessman than for regulating teachers or preachers or editors or anybody else. If a businessman steals, okay, get him. But if he simply supplies what a lot of people want at prices they can afford to pay, he's rendering a service. You may have read a book by the great sociologist Weber, W-E-B-E-R, called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Made quite a dent in this century, published in a couple of journal articles, turn of the century, available in English in 1932. Weber's point, basic point, was that the Protestant ethic, the thing that came in with the Reformation, was to sanctify all kinds of honest work. Anybody, any laborer who turned out an honest product, which people needed or wanted and could afford to buy, was doing God's will. The religious vocation for Weber, or for the reformers, was broadened to include any good work, not just the work you would do in a monastery or a convent, say. So, yeah, I'm not sure Ike has read Weber, but that's it.
I have a little problem with the fact we talk about the American dream starting about 200 years ago and major changes of the accretion of wealth, increase of surplus, and a chance to move financially. But we always overlook the fact we stole a whole continent from some people already owned it, called Indians.
Right.
And when you add that much capital for free into the system through plunder, you have a lot of ramifications which make everybody feel pretty well off.
Mm-hmm.
If you include the whole hemisphere, and you start talking about gold and the inflation in Europe that created things, a lot of things changed which we attribute to breakthroughs in enlightenment, which is basically a case of just raw plunder. Then we take 30% of the population decide they didn't like the system, overthrow it by force, which we call the American Revolution, and disenfranchise 70% of the population, especially in New York State. And we say that was a big breakthrough of freedom. And I have a little problem with hypocrisy that's kind of built into the program. We tend to write our own history books, don't we?
No question. I'll be quoting a statement of Mises on Friday, in case some of you left by that time. It occurs in socialism. The same statement occurs in human action about 30 years apart. All ownership derives from occupation and violence. I mentioned the Norman Conquest. I think we shouldn't be sentimental and sanitize history. The Norman Conquest was surgically clean compared to our own conquest. We fought over 100 officially declared wars against the Indians. Then you come to the question, here we had a landmass. I forget now how many square miles this landmass of the 48 amounts to, but many, maybe several million square miles, occupied by maybe 250,000 people, maybe 500,000, under 1 million. Difficult to estimate the number of Indians. Is it God's will, or is it sensible, or is it reasonable, or is it right that this vast, rich landmass should be the protected private domain of a few 100,000 people? Or is it better that it should come into the possession of the several millions of people who are here now, who have produced unimaginably in all categories, who send their goods out all over the world, either for free or whatever? Anyway, I don't know the answer to this.
Like Rockefeller giving out dimes, isn't it? After you steal it,
okay.
away. Sure.
But that's about the way human life is, and Edmund Burke said we should draw a decent veil over the origins of society. If we focus just on the battle, that occurred, and ignore the tremendous socializing processes that occurred in the aftermath of the conquest, we're focusing on the wrong thing. Yes.
Okay, just make the point that Norman Conquest, you say, was so efficient. It was one-day battle at Hastings. It was a one-day battle.
No, there were about 30 other battles. But
1066.
1066, yeah.
One day.
Well, that one battle, but they fought several of the battles to fully conquer the island. But it was close, yes. It was close.
Thereafter.
Right. Shortly thereafter.
What we're talking about was a one-day battle.
Pretty much, yeah.
10,000 people killed with arrows.
Yeah, but
15-minute break to 11:15, and at that time I'll describe the changes.